Hello friends, welcome to the studio. We are here today to make a jacket. Specifically, we're going to be making a chore jacket. For those of you who aren't familiar with what a chore jacket is, it's a workwear style jacket that originated in France in the 1800s. They're very classic, very versatile. I love them. I own several, but I don't own one in kind of a classic navy blue colorway, so that is what we are here today to make. This is going to be a two-part project. Obviously, we have to start by constructing the jacket itself, but after that, we'll be doing some design work on the jacket using my chain stitch embroidery machine. This is a vintage style hand-operated embroidery machine that's commonly known for its use in workwear and Western garments, particularly on jackets. This will be the largest scale project that I've done on this machine so far. I got it relatively recently, and I'm excited to really dive into a more serious project like this. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves here. We have to make the actual jacket first. So let's get into it. First step, we have to cut out all of our pattern pieces. I'm starting here by cutting out my interfacing, which is basically just a stabilizer that's applied to specific pieces of the pattern to give them more structure where it's needed. The fabric that I'm using for this project is an 8-ounce cotton twill from Stone Mountain & Daughter Fabrics. I'll put a link to it in the caption if you're interested. And the pattern that I'm using is called the Foreman by Merchant & Mills, which I will also link below. As you can see, I've laid out all my pattern pieces and pinned them down onto the fabric at once. That way I can try and organize things as efficiently as possible and not waste any more fabric than I need to. I always make sure to clip any notches and punch any holes that are marked on the pattern pieces because they're super helpful as guides when you're trying to line things up later. Next, I'm just setting up my workstation, so getting my ironing boards out, adding water to my iron, and then threading both my serger and my sewing machine. For those of you who aren't familiar, a serger is used for overlocking raw edges so that they're nice and clean and they won't unravel, and my normal sewing machine is just used for kind of standard sewing. Here I'm grabbing the pieces of interfacing that I cut out and matching them up to their fabric pieces, and then using my iron to attach them because the heat fuses the two fabrics together. And I'm using this pressing cloth because sometimes if you iron directly onto fabric, it can be a little bit funky, like it can cause some weird marks or some shininess, so the pressing cloth helps avoid that. The first pieces of the jacket that we're going to construct are the pockets. So here I'm just pressing the pieces, serging the top edges, and then sewing them down so they lie on the inside and we have a nice clean edge on the outside. Then I'm just clipping the corners so that when we turn them to the right side, we get nice sharp corners, and clipping some triangles out of these curves so that when we pull up the E-stitching and press them, there will be less bulk. And there we have a beautiful, clean pocket. Once all three of them are prepped, I start placing them onto the front of the jacket and pinning them into place before I sew them on. And look how nice that is. Ugh. As you can see, I've added some extra top stitching to give it a very clean finish, and you'll be seeing a lot of that in this project. Next, we have to assemble the collar. So here I'm just pinning and then sewing together the two pieces of the under collar, clipping my curves so that we can reduce bulk, and then pressing and edge stitching my seam so that everything lays in the right direction. Then I have to do that same process for the upper collar, and then I sew those two pieces together. Here I'm doing what's called layering my seam allowances, which is basically just cutting one edge of the seam allowance to reduce bulk again, and then turning my corners out. Once that's all done, I just have to top stitch the collar, and wow, I love how that looks. Now I'm just taking the two front pieces and the back piece and sewing them together so that we get the full body of the jacket. Then taking my finished collar, I pin that along the neckline and sew it all together. This is really the first point where it starts to resemble a piece of clothing, so I had to try it on. Next we have to add our inner facing, so I'm just grabbing the two pieces of the front facing and the neck facing, sewing them together, and then attaching all of that to the body of the jacket. Once it's all attached, we have to trim our corners, layer our seam allowances, and clip our curves. I just have to be honest, I love ironing. It's so satisfying. Here I'm pinning and sewing down the neck facing so that it's not just kind of flopping around. And then I had to sew down my side seams and serge the edges. We are now entering the phase of the project where I just do an absurd amount of top stitching. I really like the way that top stitching looks, and so I do way more than the pattern even calls for, but yeah, it's a lot. Every good jacket needs sleeves, so here I'm just grabbing all my sleeve pieces, pressing them, and then pinning them together, matching those handy dandy notches that I marked earlier. I think the hardest part of this whole jacket is sewing the top stitching down the sleeves. Once they're in a tube like this, it's just so hard to maneuver the fabric and it gets so bunched up and it's just so frustrating. But once we're past that, I just have to turn up the sleeve hems and press them and then top stitch them, which is much easier. The pattern calls for a couple rows of ease stitching at the top of each sleeve so that when you go to set them into the jacket body, you can kind of pull them up and get them to fit nicely. Then I just have to sew them together, press the seam allowance to the right side, and yep, you guessed it, more top stitching. Here I'm just marking where I'm going to put my buttonholes with some chalk. Then I go to add them on. I always have trouble with my actual buttonhole function on my sewing machine, so I usually do these manually, which is like a very wide, very short zigzag stitch. Once I've sewn all the borders, I can cut the buttonholes open, and then I just go ahead and sew my buttons on. Finally, I'm just sewing on a little woven label to the bottom of the jacket that has my logo on it, just for fun. The jacket is done. I love it so much. I think this is easily one of my favorite things I've ever sewn. I've made this pattern a handful of times now, and looking at the progression from the first one I made to this one, I'm just really proud of how my technical sewing abilities have grown. And I really do think it helps a lot to make the same pattern multiple times just to get really comfortable with it. Now that this is done, we have some embroidery work to do. This is the design that I put together for the back graphic. I took inspiration from a handful of different vintage and modern workwear jackets that have beautiful chain stitch designs on them. And to try and make it feel authentic, I created a fake company and designed this graphic kind of based around that. Since I'm a little bit nervous to just jump in and do this on the jacket that I just spent so long making, I went ahead and did a practice version on a scrap piece of fabric. And I'm really glad I decided to do this because I think I figured out some technique stuff that's going to make the actual version go a lot more smoothly. So, well, let's get into it. To transfer my design to the jacket, I'm using this tearaway stabilizer. And since I don't have a large format printer, I had to print this out in some separate pieces and then cut them out and kind of try and reorganize them on the jacket in the right lockup. Once my design is prepped, I go ahead and get my machine ready to go. So here I'm just threading it, and when you thread these machines, you have to go just kind of hang out under the table for a second, which is always fun. and then I start embroidering. So as you can see, I just have the stabilizer pinned to my fabric, and then I'm stitching right on top of it. And once I've done the outlines, to fill it in, essentially all I'm doing are small overlapping circles of stitches. This handle under the machine controls which direction the machine is stitching in, so when I'm filling, you can see that it just kind of goes around and around and around. To secure the embroidery, I have to tie off each of these loose ends with a sewing needle. So to start, I just bring the thread back underneath to the bottom of the jacket, and then tie it off in a knot and cut off the excess. Once I've stitched all the letters on a piece of stabilizer, then I can go in and tear away the extra material. Usually you might do the outlines and then take off the stabilizer and fill it, but since I'm using a white thread on a dark fabric, this helps kind of fill in the gaps so you don't see the fabric through the thread. This process is actually pretty slow. It's a lot of deliberate stitching, trying to get clean lines and maneuver the fabric in a way that you can get sharp corners, and yeah, just trying to be as precise as possible. After I finish that top row of type, I'm moving down to the center illustration. And as you can see, this is all just line work. So the way that I like to do that is I'll do a row of stitching, and then I'll turn around and go back over it again in the opposite direction to give it a nice thick line. And then we get to do some different colors. So rethreading the machine one at a time, we're doing some red, then we're doing some orange, and finally we're doing some yellow. And I forgot to do our dog's tongue, so had to break out the red again and get that done. The process for the rest of this back graphic is pretty much exactly what I've already talked about, so I'm just gonna shut up for a while and let you enjoy some clips. Once the back design was done, the last touch that I had to do was adding my name to the front chest. And I'm bad at cursive, so this is my best try, okay? It's done, and I am obsessed with it. I really think this might be one of my favorite projects I've ever made. I'm just so happy with the way that the jacket fits me. I'm so happy with how the design turned out. Just really everything about this. I'm so happy with the end result. And while the process was very fun, I'm glad that it's over. It was a lot of work, a lot of learning on this project for sure, and I'm excited to show it to people. I hope that you enjoyed. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more things like this in the future, feel free to subscribe, and you can find me in other places online at Craig Miller Studio and craigmillerstudio.com. And I will see you next time.